I feel like you guys are all at my butt. Woo! Woo! Sour shoes. Alright, so this is a short passage for me. And this is where I talk about my mom and when I talk about that my mom suffered from mental illness, what it was like for me at 10 years old and how some of these stories might relate to how I ended up on the show. My mom's issues stemmed as much from her temper as they did from her mental instability. There was a line she crossed where she gave way to the other, like she couldn't find an off switch. One day we went to A&S, the department store in Hempstead, to buy some new school clothes. My mom tried to pay with a credit card that was in my father's name, but the sales lady wouldn't accept it. Naturally, my mom flew into a rage. She started throwing my clothes, which were sitting in a pile on the counter, at the lady. Those were followed by the black Chuck Taylor high tops I had picked out. One of the Chucks hit the sales lady in the head while she was on the phone with security. Then we sprinted out of the store to avoid getting arrested. The temper problems meant that even when my mom was in the right, she'd occasionally wind up in the wrong. In our part of town, she had a lot of friends, but she also had a lot of people she perceived to be enemies. That's how it was with her. Everything was black and white. You were her friend, or you were her enemy. Our next-door neighbors happened to be enemies. The houses on my street were practically on top of one another, separated by just a thin driveway. The older son next door was just a grade ahead of me, and for some reason, he had it in for me. He constantly beat the crap out of me. It became a regular topic of conversation in my house. What are we going to do about Gary getting beaten up? I was in the 3rd grade. Finally, one warm spring afternoon, my mom decided she was going to go next door and have a chat with the guy's mom. It was just like out of the Brady Bunch, where Peter was getting picked on, and Mike and Carol went over to the bully's house, expecting everyone to be reasonable. Except in my case, they weren't. With me on her heels, my mom walked over and knocked on our neighbor's door. I noticed a lot of kids playing ball in the street. I stopped myself at the very edge of our property line on the driveway, which meant I was still pretty close to listen to the conversation. I'd never been in their house and was really anxious about being as close as I was. Our neighbor opened her screen door, but instead of inviting my mom in, she stepped out onto the top step of the three-step stoop. My mom said, "I want your son to leave my son alone." So far, so good. A perfectly reasonable request. Carol Brady would have been proud. Then our neighbor answered in a flippant, casual tone, "Maybe your son could defend himself." Uh-oh. I can't remember who dropped the F-bomb first, but in a matter of seconds they were flying. And the neighbor was yelling, "Fuck you." My mom yelled it back, and then my mom pushed her. My first thought was, let's get out of here now, Mom. This isn't working. We should walk away right now. What am I doing here? I knew that my mom would get herself worked up and it would be impossible to stop this thing from escalating. There would be no turning back. Our neighbor couldn't believe she'd been pushed. She stood there, her mouth open, like she was watching a scary movie, only she was in it. Now people were starting to gather around. The kids who'd been playing ball in the street dropped their bats and stared. Then my mom took it to another level. There were shrubs and a flower bed just to the side of our neighbor's stoop, underneath the big bay window. As the woman stood there, my mom reached down and pulled up some shrubs. She must have caught a glimpse of the roots because she decided that they might make a good weapon. Then she started bashing our neighbor with the shrub. Dirt was flying everywhere. By now the neighborhood parents were in the street watching too. They were fascinated, amazed, horrified, and stunned. I was petrified and embarrassed. This is not what we came here to do, I thought. My mom had started out on the right, and now she was beating our neighbor with her shrubbery. So that gives a little bit of an idea.
Nice work! Good stuff, good stuff.
And I'm not even positive that was due to my mother's mental illness. I think that's just because she's Italian and protective.